Do any of you remember back 10 years ago, a long time, the ancient past, when those miners were trapped in Chile, and the way in which the whole world followed the story of how they were contacted, how a hole was drilled down to them, and then one by one they were brought up and reunited with their families. And we all rejoiced as they rejoiced. Well, just the same as we rejoiced at the good news then, I have good news for you today. Jesus is coming back soon. And that really must be the best news that there could possibly be. We'll be rescued from the dark prison of this earth instead of just being rescued from the dark prison of a collapsed mind. But you may say, what's your basis for saying that Jesus is coming back soon? In fact, you may have heard the same message from Jehovah's Witnesses, coming knocking on your door, telling you that Jesus is coming soon, or the end of the world is near, or something. If you ask them what their basis is for saying that, they will turn to Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus said you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but they tend to be a bit quiet about the rest of the verse, where Jesus said, see that you are not alarmed, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. In other words, the end will not be brought about by these things. Wars, disasters, human wickedness, they are not signs that Jesus is coming soon. They are signs that he needs to come soon, that the world is getting old and wicked, but not that he will come soon. And the very next verse in Matthew 24 says the sort of thing. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Now, I don't know if you can remember back to your first child, when you didn't know what it was all about, and the very first twinge of labor, and you were rushing off to the hospital, and the nurses who'd seen it all before said, go away, come back in a couple of hours' time. Well, in the same way, earthquakes and other natural disasters are not signs of Jesus soon coming. There have always been such things. And though they may get worse as the end approaches, how much worse is worse? So how do we know that Jesus is coming soon? Why can I say so confidently that Jesus is coming soon, that he will soon return? Well, I'd like to refer you to a passage in Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 3, where Paul speaks about the last days. Not the last day, but the last days. And he says that in those days, there'll be terrible times because people will be lovers of themselves, they'll be lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Well, boy, that just sounds like the headlines from our newspapers today. Because people, Paul said, will be lovers of money. Well, of course, that's a very good definition of capitalism, isn't it? Lovers of money. People in the last days will be disobedient to parents. You know, we've had to invent a new term to describe young people these days, juvenile delinquents. But even more significantly, Paul says that in the last days, people will be without love. And the word that's used there in the Greek, astergos, means without natural love. The love of a man for a woman, or a parent for a child. Divorce rates are just going through the roof. There are more divorces almost than there are marriages. And parents, instead of looking after their children, are abusing them. And instead of being loved and protected. And of course, we have unnatural love. While natural love is languishing, unnatural love is increasing. We think of the flood tide of pedophiles, such as dear old Gary Glitter, Jimmy Savile, the nation's favorite broadcaster at one time. And there's other forms of unnatural love, homosexual love, which is now almost considered normal. Or in fact, if you listen to the BBC, you'd think it was the heterosexual love that was abnormal. Paul says that in the last days, people will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And certainly it is true that while Places of pleasure like pubs and clubs are booming. Chapels and churches are closing. In Wales, at one time, they were closing at the rate of one a day. And if the number of closures is less, it's only because there are fewer chapels these days to close. I can remember some years ago, I was preaching in this chapel in Tywyn near Rhyl, a Presbyterian chapel. Inside, there were only 8 people. And I was having to raise my voice, and I've got a pretty powerful voice, but it was necessary because outside there was a Sunday market just crammed with people going noisily about their business and enjoying themselves rather than worshiping God. Paul says that in the last days men will have a form of godliness but deny its power, and you don't get much more form of godliness than a bishop, do you? And when you have bishops denying the resurrection and bishops, and bishops disregarding what the Bible has to say about morality, Paul says, have nothing to do with such men. Now, the thing is that I have had people say to me, oh, but that doesn't prove anything. You should have seen what it was like when I was young. The things we got up to, these days are pretty tame compared to what we did when we were young. Well, that may be true, but I think the significant thing is that these days, well, once upon a time, you could travel around the world and you knew where you were by the style of architecture, the clothes that people wore, the food that people ate. And in those days, while one part of the world was up, religiously speaking, another part of the world was down. We might think of back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when the revolting French were down, where they were abolishing religion and executing their king and so on during the Revolution. And at that exact same time, in Britain, religion was flourishing under the influence of John and Charles Wesley, who were leading a tremendous spiritual revival that is said to be the reason why we in Britain did not have a revolution. But then later on, the Methodists began to grow a little bit cold and formal, and then God raised up the Pietists in Germany, and they led a Reformation in Germany. Religion was up in Germany. And when the Pietists began to get a bit formal and cold, then God raised up the great evangelists and revivalists like Moody in America. And so it went on, one place up, while another place down. But today we live in a world that is very shrunken, that is very small, where there is a world culture that seems to be taking over. From America in the west to China in the east, from Russia in the north to Australia or South Africa in the south, everybody listens to the same music, rock and roll. Everybody wears the same clothes, jeans. Everybody eats the same food, Big Macs. Everybody drinks the same drinks, Coca-Cola. Part that is, of course, from the ladies. They drink Diet Coke. So, you see, we today live in a world where we can say that conditions in society show that we are living in the last days. Society not just in one country or one nation, but worldwide. That is the significant thing. Now, Peter also spoke about the last days. And he said that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming, he promised. Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. They deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of ungodly men. So Peter says that in the last days, men and women will forget that God created the world and that God destroyed the world by a flood. And certainly we are seeing that these days. It was in 1844 that Charles Darwin first wrote down his ideas of evolution. And 15 years later, in 1859, he published his famous book, The Origin of Species. And the interesting thing is that his theory is founded on the two principles foretold by Peter: uniformity and a natural origin with no room for God. When I lead tours to the Middle East, very often we have a little bit of time left over on the last day before our flight leaves, and so I take them to the Sorek caves, not far from where Samson and Delilah used to live. Before we're allowed in to view all the stalactites and stalagmites, can you remember which ones go up and which go down? There's a member of staff who gives us a little talk about how the water has been dripping down from the ceiling, and over thousands and millions of years, those drips have left behind a tiny little bit of calcium, and so a stalactite has grown up. And this person doesn't actually say, ever since the fathers fell asleep, everything has gone on since the beginning of creation, but that's what they mean. There's been no change. There's no alteration in the amount of water that's flowed through those caves. It's all been going on at the same rate ever since the beginning. Many years ago, I visited the Grand Canyon in America. And in those days, there were sufficiently few visitors that before you left the visitor center, you were given a lecture by a park ranger. And the park ranger would describe how the Colorado River is cutting away its bed at the rate of so many millimeters per year, and how many million tons of soil have been washed away, and so we can calculate how old the Grand Canyon is. And again, he didn't say ever since the fathers fell asleep, but that's what he meant. Everything has been carrying on at the same rate, the same way in which it has been carrying on in these days. And of course, with this idea of evolution, there is no room for God. So conditions in society show us that we are living in the last days. And the theory of evolution shows that we are living in the last days. But it isn't only in the New Testament that we are told about this period, because in Daniel, we are told about the time of the end, not the end of time, notice, but the time of the end. You, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will rush here and there, and knowledge will be increased. And I can illustrate that by talking about the time when my family and I went down to Portsmouth, down in South England. In those days, they hadn't dug up the Mary Rose, so the only attraction we could see was the Victory, HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship. But as we were driving along this street on the way out, I spotted something interesting round about there, and something made me get out, park the car on a double yellow line, look around for the traffic wardens, and nip out and go across to look at this gateway. Here you can see it in reality from the outside. Inside that gateway on the wall, there is a plaque which talked about how it had been erected to commemorate the safe return of Prince Charles from his voyage to Spain. And when I read that, I was delighted because I knew about this voyage to Spain. You see, back in the 1600s, James VI of Scotland became the King James I of England. He's the man who translated the Bible into English, the King James Version. And naturally, he tried to rule as a king and to make good dynastic marriages for his children. And he arranged for his daughter Elizabeth to marry Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, who became the King of Bohemia in 1619. Unfortunately, the Bohemians didn't like him, and so they slung him out so quick that he became known as the Winter King, because he had such a short reign. I think it was only about six months, between 1619 to 1620 or whatever it was. Naturally, Elizabeth appealed to her father to help her husband get back onto the throne. But James, he didn't have any money. So to try and help his daughter, he came up with the idea of marrying his son, Charles, to the Spanish infanta or princess, because the Spaniards in those days had plenty of money. But Charles dug his heels in and said he wasn't going to marry anyone unless he'd met them, unless he'd seen them. So his father somewhat reluctantly gave him permission to go to Spain. And he set off with just one companion, George Villiers, who was later made Duke of Buckingham for his services, on a very romantic journey across the Channel to Calais, then across France, over the Pyrenees, down to Spain, where he met the girl, Maria Ana, the Infanta of Spain. But unfortunately, I don't know what went wrong. Some have suggested that the Spanish court was very hidebound and formal, and they just did not approve of this fellow turning up just with one single attendant after riding on horseback. Very infra-dig. So Charles and George Villiers got on board an English ship and sailed back to Britain, landing at Portsmouth. And when they landed, safe and sound from their long voyage to Spain, and best of all, without a Spanish bride, the whole country went mad. There were bonfires on hilltops, the church bells were rung in every steeple, fountains flowed with wine, people rejoiced in the streets, and someone erected that plaque in the gateway at Portsmouth to commemorate the safe return of Prince Charles from his voyage to Spain. Now, some years ago, I used to go down to visit a farmer, Bob Jones, down in the countryside near Cerrig-y-Drudion. He had 4 children, and their names all began with I. He started off with a girl, Iris, and then came another girl, Yola, and then came another girl, Ida, and finally came the longed-for son, Yuan. So I used to go down there and visit them every so often and, ask how the family was getting on and how's Iris, how's Yola, how's Yuan? Well, I got plenty of information on how Yuan was doing. But one time when I went and asked how Iris was, the answer came, she's not here. She's gone to Spain. Just think of that. A little Welsh girl from the countryside gone on that long, difficult, dangerous voyage to Spain. And why? Some pressing reason of state? No, just so that she could get a better suntan. And when she returned, there were no national celebrations, no bonfires, nobody erected a plaque at Gatwick. Why not? Because these days, traveling to Spain is an everyday affair. Well, perhaps not these particular days with COVID-19, but you know what I mean. And millions of people today travel all over the world for their holidays. It's a normal thing to do. Staying at home is the unusual thing. Many will rush to and fro, Daniel was told. It's only a little over 100 years, and this was the fastest means of transport from A to B. Yet today, we can get on board a plane and fly at 500, 600 miles an hour, and nobody thinks anything of it. When we lived in London, we had these planes flying overhead 1 every 3 minutes with up to 500 people on board. Amazing. Many will run to and fro in the last days, in the time of the end. And knowledge will be increased. It's not all that long, again, only a couple of centuries, since people believed that you could get to the edge of the flat earth and stick your head out through the firmament, the first heaven, and see God's second and third heavens in front of you. And then came men like Tycho Brahe and Copernicus, who revolutionized our knowledge of the heavens. Today we have radio telescopes, and, we're able to map the universe in tremendous detail. And in fact, we've even gone up into space, and men have walked on the moon, and there's talk of sending men to Mars. But it's not just out in outer space that knowledge has increased. Do any of you remember this? When a television looked like this, with a black and white screen? I can remember the very first television I ever saw. It was in 1958. I was 9 years old, and we traveled from India to England, and we went to the wonders of Oxford Street, to Selfridges. Wow, the very first department store we'd seen. And my parents went off looking at the wonders that they were interested in. My sisters went off to look at the toys. Me, I was stood staring at a television screen. Wow. And what was on the television screen? Cowboys and Indians or Dick Lightning or something? Nope. It was the test card. And why was I looking at it so intently? Very simple. Because down the bottom was the words, "Color transmissions will begin shortly." And I was waiting to see this thing burst into color. And I didn't realize that you needed a color television in order to have color pictures. Well, of course, today We have great big huge screens, flat screens, 52 inches, 72 inches, or even more, sitting on our living room walls. And we think nothing of it, even though a color television is perhaps one of the most complicated things man has ever made, even more complicated than the space shuttle. I can remember the very first time I saw a computer. It was at Andrews University in America. And we weren't allowed to go into the room. We had to stand in the doorway and look in and not breathe heavily while men in special white suits walked around attending to this marvelous computer that took up most of the room. Today, of course, my little laptop has more computing power than that whole room full of electronics. And I can surf the internet and see webcams all over the world showing me what's going on at that very moment in India or China or America, or it's just amazing. Truly, knowledge has increased, showing that we are living in the time of the end. So conditions in society show that we are living in the last days. The theory of evolution shows that we are living in the last days. The increase of travel and knowledge shows that we are living in the last days and the time of the end. But that's a somewhat indefinite period. How long is the last days? How long is the time of the end? Well, fortunately, Jesus gave us the information which enables us to more or less pinpoint when he will come again. In Matthew 24, that same chapter that I referred to right at the very beginning, Jesus' disciples came to him and said, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? And Jesus gave them a whole list of things, wars and rumors of wars and famine and plagues, and said, don't be worried by these, because these are just the beginning of sorrows. These are not signs of my coming. And then he said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. When I was a boy growing up in India with missionary parents, I often heard them discussing how Jesus could possibly come in the near future, because at that time there were three very big problems. There was darkest Africa. We were still taking up special mission offerings for darkest Africa. How would we ever reach the millions of heathen in Africa? And then there were the jungles of the Amazon. This was only 25 years after Colonel Fawcett had disappeared. You probably haven't even heard of him these days. It was one of the great mysteries of the 1930s, I think it was. The Amazon jungles with all these uncontacted tribes. How could the gospel ever reach them? And then, of course, there were the communist countries of Russia and China, the USSR, that were actively against religion. How could the gospel be preached in those countries within our lifetimes even? Well, darkest Africa is now Christian Africa. There are more Christians in Africa south of the Sahara, and a higher proportion of the population is Christian than there are in Europe. Africans are coming over here as missionaries to preach the gospel to the heathens in Britain and Europe. Christian Africa, what a change. The Amazon jungles, the only problem these days is, are there going to be any jungles left? Are there any tribes left that have not yet been contacted, that don't have mobile phones and are not capable of hearing the gospel preached in some way or another? And the communist countries? Well, communism fell in Russia. It hasn't fallen in China. Christians are still being persecuted, but even so in China, there is a strong, thriving, flourishing Christian church. Truly, the end can come at any time, because the three great obstacles that we identified in my childhood have all been swept away. Once, we rejoiced when missionaries set sail for foreign lands. Today, missionaries travel by jet, and when they get to the foreign lands, they're taken around in planes by the Missionary Aviation Fellowship, and they zoom from one place to another, preaching the gospel. But it's not just missionaries. The gospel is being preached by the modern media of radio and television. There are great conventions being held where thousands of people hear the gospel at the same time. The Bible has been translated into more languages than ever before. Books are being widely distributed, and if you can't get hold of them in solid form, you can get hold of them over the internet. And you can read the Bible on the internet, online. And there are correspondence courses online. You don't even have to be at home. You can sit on the beach, and using your 4G or 5G phone, you can surf the internet and listen to the gospel even there. And if nowhere else, you can always go to my nwtv.co.uk website. One day, soon, the last man or woman on earth will have heard the message and will have accepted it or rejected it. And then shall the end come, as Jesus said. And in that day, there will only be two groups of people. There will be those who are not ready for Jesus' return, who don't want him to come back. The kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" But there will be another group, probably a smaller group, who will look up with joy and say, "This is our God. We have waited for him and he will save us." The very last words of the Bible is a repeated promise that Jesus will come again. He who testifies to these things says, "Yes, I am coming soon." And John's response, "Amen. Come, Lord Jesus." And so my prayer is that when Jesus does return, you will be among those who are waiting for him, who are looking forward to his coming. May it indeed be soon.